My name's Tom Jennings, and this is the 24 Frames cast. Henri-Georges Clouzot is a filmmaker who is perhaps most well known for his 1953 masterpiece, The Wages of Fear. It was certainly my introduction to his filmography, and like all directors who I become interested in, I made the effort to go through and watch every film I could get my hands on in his filmography. In total, he made 11 films, and for all the ones I've seen, I have been massively impressed with them all. He is often compared to France's Alfred Hitchcock, and I feel that this comparison is not entirely accurate. Indeed, I would argue that he is, in my opinion anyway, a slightly more interesting filmmaker than Alfred Hitchcock. He began his career in the 1930s working as a screenwriter and production assistant at UFA Studios in Germany, and it was his exposure to the German filmmaking of the time, with its emphasis on atmosphere and tightly constructive narrative, that left a lasting imprint on his style. His breakthrough came during the German occupation of France with the film Le Cœur Brûlé. It is a dark tale in which a community turns on itself after a series of anonymous poison pen letters begin tearing the town apart. And it was also a production that would see Clouzot temporarily banned from filmmaking. He was accused of having collaborated simply working within the occupation era system. And this period of professional exile was crucial for his development because he understood firsthand how public judgment formed and had worked against him. And he experienced firsthand how the admiration for his work could turn to condemnation so quickly. And in 1949, he returned to filmmaking with the film I'm going to be talking about today, Manon. And it was a film made when France was still coming to terms with the legacy of the war. There were questions of guilt, collaboration, how had France fallen so easily, and who had stood up to the occupation. And it were questions that he himself was having to confront. And I think Manon is a pivotal moment in his career. The film would go on to win the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival, and it was the point at which Clouzot had become internationally respected within the world of cinema, and his reputation would only grow later on with The Wages of Fear and Les Diaboliques. His style was admired for its meticulous construction, its moral bleakness, and his refusal, or at least unwillingness, to offer comforting resolutions. And it's these reasons, I think, that I was so taken with Manon the first time I watched it. I generally had no idea where the film was going, and indeed it surprised me in so many ways. And I really want this podcast to be about, at times, pointing people in directions towards films which they wouldn't normally perhaps gravitate towards. So in this episode, I'm going to do a deep dive into Manon and hopefully explain why this is such a pivotal film in the career of Henri-Georges Clouzot. Manon opens in the immediate aftermath of the liberation of France, and in a small provincial town, a young woman named Manon is about to be publicly humiliated for her apparent collaboration with German soldiers. There's a crowd around her, accusations are flying, and we're not entirely sure what it is she might have done. It seems quite flimsy. She was just seen talking to the Germans who came into the shop that her mother owned, and she may have well spent some time dancing with her, but you rather get the impression that Manon might just be the girl who everyone in the village hates. The men want to be with her, the girls want to be her, and this is just her collective punishment for merely existing. But at the last moment, she is rescued by Robert, a member of the French resistance. He intervenes and helps her escape the crowd. We're not sure if he believes that she's entirely innocent, but we do at least see that he does believe that she's undeserving of the cruelty she's about to face. And from this point forward, The pair are inseparable. They decide to flee together, building a new life away from the village and the public scrutiny and suspicion. But their relationship is far from stable from the start. Robert is deeply, almost blindly devoted to Manon. Meanwhile, she herself is somewhat restless. She longs for comfort, security, and a kind of luxury that seems permanently out of reach in this country that has now been utterly devastated by the war. And as they move through post-war France, they become entangled in black market dealings and increasingly questionable schemes. Robert's love and devotion for her forces him to take risks that he otherwise may have avoided. And Manon is drawn towards wealth and status whenever the opportunity presents itself, often placing great strain on their fragile relationship. Eventually, the pair decide it's time to leave France entirely, and they find themselves amongst refugees heading towards Palestine. And they later become stranded in North Africa, and the reality of their new existence becomes crushingly real. What struck me most when I watched Manon for the first time was its depiction of post-war France. And when I was researching this episode, I came across the case of Marshal Pétain, the hero of the First World War, and I knew what his background was. He had essentially saved France at the Battle of Verdun and was a bona fide hero of the country. Yet in 1940, after France's defeat by Germany, he became head of the Vichy regime and collaborated with Nazi authorities. And under his stewardship, the Vichy state assisted in forcing German policies, including the persecution and deportation of Jews. And when the war ended, Pétain was put on trial for treason. He was found guilty, sentenced to death, which was later commuted to life imprisonment, and died basically under house arrest in 1951. And it really was a kind of symbolic reckoning for France, because it was forced to confront a very uncomfortable truth that collaboration was something that just simply wasn't limited to the odd individual. It had existed within the state itself, indeed at its highest level amongst its most revered characters. And this had very profound psychological consequences for the country. And this climate is reflected in Manon's tone and its narrative structure, because when we arrive in the film, it is at the moment of France's liberation, yet it doesn't seem a moment to be enjoyed. We're not hearing the Marseillaise being sung. And in this we see Manon, who is about to be punished by a mob. There's obviously been no trial. She has just been selected because she was seen fraternising with German soldiers. And if what we come to know about her might be true, it's quite likely that she probably did take a few of them as her lovers. But this is never explicitly said, and it's certainly no case is put forward by the mob that this is actually true. There is a certainty to the mob's behaviour that contrasts a great deal with the ambiguity that we will see over the course of Manon. It is her sexual reputation which has convicted her, not any clear-cut facts. And this pattern of... And there were two types of justice in post-war France. There was the very public Pétain trial, where he was formally tried by a court, but many other forms of collaboration were addressed through informal, highly visible acts of punishment and humiliation, especially against women. I've seen some incredibly harrowing images from that time, especially in the immediate aftermath of the occupation, of women with shaved heads walking along roads clutching babies, and we can assume we know who the fathers of those babies were. And it really must have been quite painful for a society to turn on itself in that way. And I think Clouzot in Manon takes a very sympathetic view of women from that era in this film, and I do actually think it is quite progressive in that way. He is questioning the process of mob trial, and he forces the audience to side with someone who, I dare say, a lot of the contemporary viewers of this film would have, if they had been in that situation, been the ones victimizing and attacking the likes of Manon. And we fully understand that she's an incredibly vulnerable person, and she is rightly scared and has a very natural desire to escape from this France. What, after all, could it possibly hold for her? And it's interesting that Robert is a former resistance fighter, because this adds another dimension to the film, because he represents the victorious side of history. He is one of the heroes that has liberated France. And again, there's, I think, a kind of subtle critique going on, because the mob that is actually about to set upon Manon, what have they actually done in terms of their resistance? In fact, they might have just been quite passive, perhaps verbally disliked the Germans, but haven't actually done anything to help the country liberate itself. And I think through Robert we experience really kind of firsthand what the victory meant for a great deal many of people, and in him and Manon's case, a fairly hollow one. This is a world which is enduring incredible economic hardship, political tension, and unresolved moral questionings as to how to reckon with the occupation and what people did in it. And this is not a France that has come out the war unified or redeemed. It is a suspicious, volatile and incredibly unsettled place. There is judgment everywhere. I think Clouzot is being incredibly critical of this world with the characters of Robert and Manon. And he asks questions about the soul of France, I believe. What is it? What has it become? And can it be redeemed? I think Clouzot further interrogates the idea of this post-war world when Manon and Robert go to stay with her brother. And when we think of the family, we traditionally perhaps would see it as a kind of safe place to be, certainly in terms of its moral compass. However, in Manon, that is simply eroded, because her relationship with her brother is somewhat disturbing, to say the least. Manon quickly finds herself becoming involved as a prostitute at the behest and to the financial gain of her own brother. She is not forced into prostitution by violence. Her brother is not forcing her to do it, but she is doing it because she knows that she is desirable and her body is a sellable asset. And by having her brother not only knowing what she's doing, but actively helping her make money in this profession, it kind of reinforces a idea that a certain kind of nihilism has emerged in this post-war world. And I think it almost dooms Manon to a life of exile, because she is a marked person. Even though Robert has rescued her, he will not ever be able to erase how society sees her. She is a woman who, in a sense, her value and worth is tied to her body, and this is something that will ensure she will never be able to have a place in French society. Yet she is a woman who wants to ascend socially and certainly financially. Yet I think this is a recurring theme within Clouzot's work, that he often suggests that society is an incredibly unforgiving place, and particularly to those who are at its margins. And I think you need only rewatch The Wages of Fear to kind of really appreciate that. These are people who simply can't just go up the ladder and and move socially, they have to do it via opportunistic means. And if that means transporting a load of nitroglycerine across the jungle, then that is simply what they are going to have to do. Robert is an interesting character in Manon because on the surface he appears to be a kind of moral centre. He's a former resistance fighter, he has risked his life opposing the occupation, and has obviously intervened and saved Manon from public humiliation. He enters therefore as a rescuer, someone who seems to represent justice and compassion in contrast to the cruelty of the other people in the film. Yet as the film progresses, Clouzot begins to complicate the character. He isn't who we assumed he was going to be, because he is not the stabilizing factor in the film's narrative. Instead, he becomes obsessive and emotionally dependent on Manon. And what's interesting here is because although he occupies a central narrative role, Manon is fundamentally her story. It is obviously the titular name of the film, and it is organised around her journey through the film's narrative and her social position. And this is important because in many classical narratives, particularly in American cinema of the 1940s, male characters drove the action and female characters tended to act as objects of desire or temptation. And even when women were centrals, their stories were often framed around redemption. And what I think Clouzot's doing is he's constructing his own version of a women's picture from this period, but he has stripped it of its sentimentality and indeed a kind of moral reassurance. Because Manon is not, she's neither purely virtuous or purely destructive. She is an incredibly inconsistent person. We never really feel like we have nailed her down as to what she is truly like, and she isn't there to be redeemed in what we would consider a kind of conventional narrative way. Instead, she is a character moulded by circumstance and, to some degrees, whatever opportunity she can glean from a given situation. Robert needs her to be way more like how we would imagine a typical female protagonist of this era to be. He is there to impose a kind of conformity on her, make her a good woman, make her someone who can be part of society. Yet because his devotion, sir, is so blind, Robert very quickly himself becomes involved in criminality. He essentially gives up the idea of them being a happily married couple just so he can be with her, even if that means they will always be on the periphery of society. One can easily imagine that his life has been turned completely upside down. When he was in the resistance, he knew exactly what the cause was, yet after the war, that clarity has completely disappeared. He is now involved in crime. He is actively working against the state he has worked so hard to defend, and it's all because of his absolute infatuation for her. Indeed, this goes so far, he will eventually commit murder that will push him to the extreme of having to leave France altogether, and with it any sense that Manon and Robert can settle in the new France emerging from the war. And again, I come back to the idea of this being a very Henri Clouzot version of the women's picture, because what distinguishes those from the period was that the female protagonists were often quite clear cut. They had very obvious trajectories that were designed to reassure the audiences. Their suffering and their trials and tribulations often lead to redemption and a kind of sense that social order is being reaffirmed, but we get no such reassurance here. Manon is not redeemed through any kind of suffering, and Robert is not rewarded for his devotion. Instead, both characters are exposed as being fragile, shaped by a world that's far larger than themselves. And Robert is not a hero, but he is a man who is struggling to find his meaning in this new world. And we can see that his love for her is indeed very sincere. But there is a kind of tragedy to him as the film unfolds, because we realise, as he is beginning to as well, that his love for her alone is not going to have any transformative effect on her. And in this way, it is a women's picture that it decides not to offer any kind of comfort to its audience. Clouzot doesn't sentimentalise Manon and her suffering. We just kind of see it as being part of her journey, and she never really seems to externalise her internal feelings as to about what she's doing. She just does it because it's the thing she has to do, in her eyes, to kind of get out of the situation that they're in. And if ever a film was the product of its time, I think Manon is a perfect example of this. I don't think this film could be made in a France that wasn't divided at the end of the war, where everyone had done their bit. And you have to go back to the Pétain case. This was a France in which even its biggest heroes ended up being its biggest villains. And you get a sense of through the film that Clouzot is processing that dynamic. Henri-Georges Clouzot is often called the French Hitchcock, and I think that might be too loaded a generalisation to make, because I'm sure if people were to hear that, they would think going into his films you were going to have some kind of Hitchcock style thriller with the same kind of visual style, and he's certainly not like that. And I think it's important to really kind of like talk about this film in the context of his career and why I think he is a unique director in his own right. The themes of Manon, I think, are there in Le Corbeau. There is a social pessimism, which obviously I have discussed earlier, and a sense of how he engineers suspense, especially in The Wages of Fear and Les Diaboliques. Because Manon occupies a transitional period, really, for him. It has the moral bleakness and that kind of social observation of his earlier films, but it also begins to develop and explore the intense psychological pressure and the visual style that would come to define his later films. And one of his most distinctive stylistic traits is his emphasis on environment as a force that shapes his characters' behaviour and narratives. In Le Corbeau, the provincial town becomes a closed environment in which the suspicion of the characters begins to spread throughout the community. And in The Wages of Fear, there is a ever-present physical danger. The landscape itself is almost always working against the characters to see that they fail in their quest to drive nitroglycerin through the jungle. And in Manon, I think Clouzot applies a similar kind of logic to his vision of post-war France. These settings are just not backdrops, they are spaces for us to explore the morality of these societies. And I think in the early scenes we see him adopt a kind of almost documentary-like style. The crowd that gathers around Manon feels chaotic and unpredictable, and it serves to create the tension that is in that scene. And he avoids heroic framing of his characters. Instead, he presents the scene as being unstable because you're not exactly clear what the power dynamics within it are, and the camera doesn't isolate Manon and direct you towards her. Instead, it puts her within the crowd, emphasising how vulnerable she is. And it's easy, I think, in that scene when you talk about building tension, I think there is a tension to that because you genuinely don't know what is going to happen to her. Will their rage at her escalate from perhaps just cutting her hair or marking her in some way? Will it get worse? And every time I watch the film, I'm aware that I am projecting my own fears onto her. And again, it's the same in The Wages of Fear. He lets us know things that the characters don't about the environment, and as such we begin to fear for them long before they realise they themselves are in danger. And there is a grounding in social reality, which I think is definitely one of his stylistic features. I think this is reflected even in the way that his characters speak. They speak quite coarsely. They're not prone to eloquent soliloquies or long monologues explaining their kind of inner desires and beliefs. They feel incredibly grounded in dare I say, a kind of working class. And I kind of think back to what I was saying earlier about kind of like the women's picture and the glamour of Hollywood. And I think that's a very particular thing that he does, which is to strip his films, which in this case, which is to kind of strip away the, I suppose, the beauty of film and reveal something slightly more grounded and gritty. And the environments of the film are also really worthy of note, because the interiors, for example, are often very cramped and cluttered, and characters are framed in a way that emphasises a kind of confinement. We see them shot through doorways, behind objects, or pressed into tight compositions. And there is a real sense of entrapment and claustrophobia. And the narrative drive, really, for Manon and Robert is to achieve some kind of freedom, which I think the visual style always kind of denies them this. And there is a real kind of stylistic shift that occurs in the film's final act when the narrative moves to North Africa, because instead of obviously the tight enclosed spaces that we've seen before, he presents open landscapes, and yet this open doesn't signify a kind of freedom. And I was really thinking about this when I was recently watching Lawrence of Arabia in UHD, because you get this sense that Lawrence is just completely at one in this environment. The romantic score by Maurice Jarre, this is a person in his element, yet this is not the case, and how Clouzot films it for Manon, because Robert and Manon are now exposed and the desert offers no protection to them. Any illusion of stability has gone. They are visually diminished by their surroundings and they are foreign to it. And obviously the film works to a certain conclusion, which if you haven't watched it, I will not spoil it for you. But what I also think makes Manon a real kind of unique film amongst Clouzot's filmography is the kind of the emotional tone of it. His latest films are slightly more driven by suspense and very controlled escalation. In Manon, I think those structures are far less rigid. It is an unpredictable film. You're never quite sure where it's going or how it's going to end up. And it goes through so many different environments and scenes. I think one thing for me is I'm always expecting Robert to walk out Manon, but no matter what she does, he always stays with her. And the lack, I suppose, of smoothness in the film is a real reflection of the instability of which they find themselves in. And he never really over-dramatises anything in Manon. He doesn't rely on expressive music or exaggerated performances to generate emotional impact. Instead, he just allows the tensions to ebb and flow along with the behaviour of the characters. They often make decisions very quickly, seemingly on a whim, and it reinforces the idea that they don't really have a plan. They are simply meandering from one situation to the next. And the camera never really gets that close on Manon and Robert. It observes them keeps us at a distance, even though I do find myself, it's not to say that I don't find the film cold, but he doesn't frame them heroically. We don't get lots of lovely close-ups of their faces as they stare adoringly at each other. And I think this is definitely visible in Le Corbeau, where I think he does take quite an unsentimental perspective on how his characters are behaving. And although I think the film may lack some of the, I suppose, the more suspenseful moments of his later films, I certainly think there is a foundation here for what the director that he is going to become. I think it's a crucial film in understanding his directorial journey. There are themes and directorial choices that you will see honed and expanded in his later works. And I would say definitely in the way I kind of think about Clouzot's work, this is certainly one of my favourite films. It feels incredibly modern, and I'm not sure if I mistake, I suppose, the pessimism of it for a sense that it's kind of slightly ahead of its time, or moreover, I think that just appeals to my sensibilities as a viewer. And I think it's the perfect film for what I'm trying to do with this podcast in many regards, because it isn't up there with The Wages of Fear, but it is such a gem of a film, Arrow did put out a brilliant Blu-ray release of this, and I do really recommend picking it up. So that's going to be it for my analysis of Henri Clouzot's Manon. I hope you have enjoyed it. You can get in contact with me by email at 24framescast@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter or X, or whatever it's called this day. It's Thomas24FC. So many thanks for listening, and I'll be in contact soon. Bye.